In this session, we're going to look at multi-generations in the workforce through the lens of managing up, down, and across. And we're going to cover some aspects of each of the generations, and we'll talk about some tips for managing literally up, down, and across, so that we optimize our time, our teammates' time, and we have like the least stress-filled workplace that we can if we optimize all of our skills and attributes. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, in some of the research that I've done, it's been cited that there are 5 generations in the workforce, and we've decided that we're really going to focus on 3 of them. In case you're wondering, gee, am I missing out? Why are we just focusing on 3? It's because the generation that comes ahead of the baby boomers, known as the silent generation or the veterans, they're largely moving into retirement if they haven't already moved into retirement. And the Gen X group that's following the Gen Z group that's following the Millennials, really at this point, I mean, they're basically working, if at all, like part-time, maybe summer help. And so we wanted to focus on the 3 generations that are filling our workforce the most. So we're going to focus on the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, and the Millennials. Now, you'll notice some of the dates for these generations, and I want to just share a couple of general comments. First of all, this is a bit North American-centric, so if you are participating in this webinar and you're participating from Europe, some of the dates will be a little bit different, because what we found is that the generations are shaped by events that have happened locally. The dates, you might look at the dates and you might say, gee, some of the research I did said it actually started, the baby boomers started in 1940. I wouldn't view the dates with such precision, and more importantly, when you start thinking about the people you are working with, your coworkers, your boss, and even yourself, as I go through some of the attributes for each of these generations, you might think to yourself, hey, I know my birth date falls into that baby boomer, little pocket there, little bucket. But based on the characteristics, I'm really more like a Gen Xer. And that's a very ordinary response. I would say to you the content for today is not going to be math, 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's really going to be more approximate, a little bit more subjective. One thing that has definitely shaped the workforce is attitudes. And so what I would like to take you through are a couple of perspectives then and now that have affected how people work and what drives their work. And as I step through these, I'd like you to think about people that you work with. I'd like you to think about your direct reports, your coworker, your boss, and I'd like you to think about whether or not these values come across in their behavior. The first attitude is it used to be get hired if you came out of school, get hired by the biggest firm that you could, because if you did, what you had to look forward to was a gold watch and retirement. They would employ you for life. I know some of you are probably laughing just as you think about this. And this thought, then, that belief, has now been replaced with get hired by someone. Notice it's not even a focus on the company as much as it is who can you work for who will serve as an effective mentor and show you the ropes. So there's been a little bit of a shift there. Another attitude then versus now to consider. Then the attitude was once you get hired, once you get your foot in that door, do your best and work your way up the corporate ladder. Well, I guess then there were corporate ladders. As most of us know, the corporate ladders have gotten flattened into pancakes. So now the prevalent belief is once you get your foot in the door, acquire as many skills as possible that will be needed to leverage your career. And for skills, read in between the lines there. How many different software packages can you use, can you learn, and can you become proficient at? That you can add to your resume to basically show that you have more tools in your toolbox. Another value that has shaped the workforce Then the belief was work hard and you will get promoted. You know, work hard, just do your best, and that will be noticed, and people will say to you, hey, step up. You know, we want to move you up. Well, now the prevailing attitude is, I've got to work hard to promote myself. I mean, think about LinkedIn. Think about, you know, people posting on LinkedIn and making connections. And the idea is to have a very vibrant network. You know, we can start to value ourselves through the value of our network. Who do we know? Who can we reach out to? One other value that has undergone a change in the workplace. Then the thinking was, be loyal to the company. And some of you might be thinking, well, you know, when was this then that she's talking about? She's talking about then. Well, if you start looking, if you recall, look back to the baby boomer generation, which started around the early 1940s. The 40s and the 50s, that's the then that I am talking about. So this idea of, you know, being loyal to the company has been replaced with be loyal to yourself. You know, the company may not be here tomorrow. And you start thinking about how many companies have gone through acquisitions. You think about how many companies have gone through consolidation. And it's not, you know, it's kind of reasonable to think, gee, why am I putting my faith in an organization that, you know, that might not be there at all? The last value that has undergone some change is the whole attitude of, you know, worker behavior. Then the idea was, you know, keep your nose to the grindstone, keep your ear to the ground. Basically, just stay focused on the work in front of you. You know, don't be preoccupied with anything else. This is kind of like an extension of the work hard value. But now that's been replaced with, gee, you know, be as aware as you possibly can be. You know, keep your eyes and your ears and your options open because you just never know. I think if I had to sum it up, the biggest change is that people now view themselves as a commodity, and they realize that they need to keep themselves pretty sharp if they're going to stay marketable. So here's the first poll question. What's your generation? Are you a baby boomer? Are you a Gen Xer? Are you a millennial? Are you not sure? Because it's like, oh, wow, that slide was so long ago, and I just didn't really remember the numbers. What do you think you are? And, Lark, you can close this poll question when you think it's a good time to close it.
Okay, great. Well, while people are answering this one, do you want to take one of the first questions that's come in?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So one of the first questions that's come in from our audience asks, you know, what are we starting to learn about Generation Z, so the post-millennial generation, that we should start thinking about?
I think the one thing that's very, 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 very clear is that they are wired. If we thought millennials were wired, this is beyond wired. If we thought, so I think, I'm almost thinking, my prediction is millennials on steroids. So everything we're going to talk about millennials, just, exponentially, think about what we're going to have to do in the workplace. So did we get do we have a look at that? The Gen Xers. You know what's interesting about this is that the Gen X group is the largest group represented in this webinar. And actually in the world, when you compare the size of the baby boomer generation and the size of the millennials, the Gen Xers are the smallest cohort. So I think it's interesting that we have great representation of the Gen Xers on this session. So let's get into the material. Let's talk about being the boss, or dare I say it, let's talk about being the top dog. Is that guy not adorable? I have a couple of general tips. I wanted to start generally, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give tips for managing each of the generations. So some general tips. I think this is the first one is almost hysterical, right? Avoid stereotyping. And what are we going to do? over the next 45 minutes, we're going to talk about profiles and stereotypes. But what I'm getting at here is when we're actually working with people one-on-one, we need to remember that this is a person, they have their own story, and let's respond to their stories and manage accordingly. The second tip, express your performance goals and expectations. Clearly, I think that is always smart. But I think that when you cobble that together with the third one, communicate the future in terms that enable your team members to see how they fit into the picture. What we're really getting at here is mass customization, if that expression means anything to you. Mass customization means we're going to tailor it, literally, we're going to customize for the masses. So every member of your team, whether they're a peer of yours, your boss, or someone that reports to you, is an individual. How can we make sure that they see how relevant they are to the business goal and the business is to them? Keep the values that have changed in mind. We really want to make sure that we've got a lot of connectivity there. I want to draw your attention to the third bullet up from the bottom, pairing people with different strengths to create synergy and cross-train. You know, this might sound commonsensical, but really you start thinking outside of the box, and from a cross-generational viewpoint, how can we pair people together? Because as you'll see, different generations have different strengths, and if we can leverage them, we'll have an even stronger team. The last point, offering different working options. You know, I really feel that you have to do what makes sense for the business and then what also makes sense for, for the folks. So sometimes, depending on what it is that you're working on, like if you're a brain surgeon, working remotely probably is not an option. But when it is and it makes sense, certainly something, something to do. So I'd like you to think for a second, another poll question. Which of the following activities motivates? Achievement, recognition, autonomy, all of the above, or none of the above? Base that on your work experience. And again, I'll turn it over to you, Lark, in case there's to monitor the results and close the survey.
We'll give everybody about a minute to answer, so they can just select the best option. So we are getting a number of good questions. We'll try to sprinkle them out throughout the webinar and have Ann answer them so we can get to as many as we can. So if you haven't sent in one yet, go ahead and do so. We're collecting them, and then we'll be looking through them and pulling out some of the ones that are best to answer based on the content that she's talking about. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the results. So if you haven't answered yet, go ahead and select the last one. I'll give you a few more seconds, and then we'll have Ann comment on them. So Ann, it looks like people like all of the above.
Yes, and they're brilliant. They're absolutely brilliant, because that is absolutely the right answer. Achievement means having a sense of accomplishment. So achievement means, gee, if I felt like I mastered new software, I learned a new skill, I'm learning about a new business, I'm learning about a new field, that all translates, it's very motivating, and that falls into the bucket of achievement. Recognition, I think, is probably the most obvious one, the most commonly known when you think about motivation, and that's having someone notice you and appreciate you for what you have contributed. The autonomy one is the one that is equally motivating. Autonomy means the ability to set your own schedule, the ability to set priorities within the day, priorities of your work. You might want to think of autonomy as the opposite of micromanaging. So if you're trying to be a motivator, either as a peer or as a boss, or you're trying to motivate even from managing upward, think about how you can really recognize the other person, give them a lot of autonomy. Choice is another manifestation of autonomy, and make them feel like they're accomplishing things and crossing things off the list. One more poll question, testing your savvy. So we know that the answer is definitely all of the above. But one more poll question, and that is coming up. Is money a motivator? Yes or no? money a motivator? What do you think? So, Lark, you can close this survey whenever you think enough people have had a chance to respond.
All right. Yeah, it's a pretty intuitive question. So just go ahead and choose which one that best suits you. We'll give you about 5 more seconds to answer.
I am very curious to see the responses to this poll question. And this is actually, I'm surprised. I thought the answer was going to come closer to a 50-50. And so it looks like the audience thinks, almost 82%, that money is a motivator. Okay, get ready to be a little shocked. And so now some of you are saying, what? If I got paid more money, I'd really be motivated. So here's the deal with money. If you hate your job, if you can't stand your boss, if your coworkers make you crazy, your customers and your constituents make you nuts, more money is not going to make you happy. If you are underpaid, meaning everybody else is being paid 10 grand more than you are to do the same job, okay, in that case, yeah, you do need that raise, because the fact that you are being paid less is going to bother the heck out of you. But just getting your pay to equal your coworkers, or getting a raise for a job you can't stand and people you can't stand working with, that's really not going to motivate you. So that was, I think, a little bit of a trick question, but it's true. Money's not the motivator that you think it is. And I think that this has ramifications when we're talking about managing other people. So here's what I'd like to do with the rest of the session. I'd like to do a deeper dive on each of the generations, and then I'd like to talk about what it's like to be the boss from that generational perspective and what you should do to manage other generations. And then we'll wrap up this session by talking about tips for managing up and managing across, managing laterally. So the baby boomers, the baby boomers have been called the meat generation, largely because of their size. They have been able to dominate in terms of marketing. If baby boomers like it, then the marketplace is really, really happy. We're seeing that same phenomenon with the millennials, just because of the sheer number of people in that generation. The performance orientation of the baby boomers is definitely a positive. If you're running your eyes down to where it says on-the-job liabilities, you might be a little upset if you're a baby boomer to see where it says not naturally budget-minded, and you might be thinking, I'm a great budgeter. What we're getting at here from the generational perspective, the research perspective, is that this is the group that gives into itself. I deserve it is the mentality. So if I didn't have it in the budget, if I spend a little more, I deserve it is the underlying rationale. The typical role right now, these are the more senior people in the workplace. Some of these folks, though, really love what they do. I affectionately call them the lifers. These are the folks that love auditing. They're maybe a center of expertise or experience for their peers. Some of them have come back as consultants. By the way, this baby boomer group is also the group that has coined the expression 60 is the new 30. Parenthetically, the baby boomers are the only ones that believe that. Everybody else knows 60 is not the new 30. 30 is still 30. Now, what are some of the preferences of this group if we're talking about managing these people? So let's say that you're a Gen X boss and you've got these baby boomers. What are some of the things you should be keeping in the forefront of your mind? They like to be coached, and when I use the term coach, I'm using that term to mean a style that is not dictatorial, a style that is not autocratic, that is not absolutely directive. The idea of what do you think? Asking that kind of a question and involving them. They love a personal touch. They love to know how they can make a difference. Now, you might think, well, most people like to know how they could make a difference. Most people think that they're special. But this is, for this cohort, this seems to be true more often. I'm not sure why in the research they like to focus on near-term, plans and challenges. All I could think of was, well, gee, you're looking at retirement, so you do have a kind of sense of urgency that someone who's a millennial might not have. One of the things to keep in mind that me generation, I'm special. So they really do appreciate individual recognition. So that second to last bullet ties to the second bullet. That's really the theme here. They like to be treated as an individual, even if it is a team effort. They believe that they, work hard. Keep in mind, they are closer to those veteran, senior work values. So when I was talking earlier about work hard, you'll be promoted, stay focused. The older end of the baby boomer generation does believe this. Now let's say that you report to a boomer. What should you keep in mind about the boomer as a boss? Unsurprisingly, they like structure and documented processes, and this is not because we're talking about audit. They do tend to prefer what they can touch. They do tend to prefer the structured 9 to 5 work schedule. And by the way, when I say 9 to 5, I mean it could be 8 to 4, it could be 7 to 3. What I'm getting at is they like the routine. They're cautious with new technology. Unlike the other two cohorts, the baby boomers were not raised with it. So they didn't grow up, with these, laptops. So they tend to be a little bit skeptical. And that last bullet we're talking about, they're leery of automation. They'll want a long parallel time, and they'll still probably, save the paper because the trust is not completely there. So now that I've given you this stereotypical information about the baby boomer bosses, I'd like you to think about your own work experience. How true is the profile that I just described of them for you? Do you feel it's very true? Feel it's somewhat true of the baby boomer bosses you've worked with? Do you feel it's not true at all? And maybe, I don't know, I never had a baby boomer boss. Or I can't say because I am a baby boomer boss. And I'll turn it over to you, Lark.
Great. While people are thinking about that question, here's a question that came in I think is interesting. How can we balance the keep our eyes open for the opportunities theme with the perception, while also balancing the perception of leaving a job too soon?
Okay, you have to repeat that question. I got a little lost there. So sorry.
Okay, I think this person's asking, how do we balance the option of keeping our eyes open for opportunities, but making sure they stay at a job long enough to get the skills that they are going to need to be marketable?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks so much for summing that. I really got a little tangled up there. So here's the deal, in my experience. People in a job feel comfortable in that job after a year, and they start to get a little itchy. From their boss's viewpoint, they've just, in that same year, they've just barely completed one cycle. So what I'm getting at is if you're thinking about moving within 12 months, that's way, way, way too soon. Now, you start to get comfortable from your boss's viewpoint at the 18-month mark, because now you've had more than one cycle. You're able now to see what's the same, what's different. You're able to get a little efficient at your work because you're able to recognize some patterns. So I think moving before 18 months is really too short a time frame. Try to accomplish something, And by the way, for those of you who are in managerial positions, there's no way, in my view, that you could accomplish any organizational change in less than 18 months. And 18 months would be a highly aggressive time period. So if you're in a managerial spot, the window now goes up to about 2-3 years. so that you're able to point to some effect that you have created. So what does this poll look like? Poll results. Interesting. So it's more true than it's not true. Okay. I mean, there's no real wrong answer with these poll questions. I'm really curious about what you think. Let's focus one more thing with the baby boomers. Let's focus as the baby boomer as a boss of baby boomers, and then let's focus as the boss of Gen Xers, and then the boss of Millennials. And I'm just going to highlight, because you can read faster than I can speak. I know some of you don't believe that, but that really is true. I think that when a baby boomer is managing a baby boomer, I think what we need to do here is take advantage and leverage what we have in common in terms of values. Equally important, maybe a little even more important, we've got to get baby boomers comfortable with using new methods and new technology. We've got to find ways to break down their resistance, dare I say it, fear, skepticism, whatever word you want to use, because that is dragging the baby boomers back. It's holding them back. With the Gen Xers, if you're a baby boomer, you got to get over your need for the structure and really take a hard look openly on the benefits of flexible scheduling as something that would not only enrich the job, but make it easier and motivating for the folks. Training options for Gen Xers should include CBTs, e-training, things that are shorter. You'll start to see, we're going to cover Gen Xers next. They prefer to get information in a more staccato format, faster, more bulleted. With the Millennials, they're really looking to develop, and we should be spending time there capitalizing on their, I was going to say use of technology, but it's more than just a use. I mean, it's woven into how they see the world and how they interact with the world. So I'm going to leave the baby boomers behind and move into the Gen Xers. That's the most of the people that we have listening today. Core values, balance, work and play balance. We talk about balance, work and play. That whole idea of work-life balance, definitely raised with technology, very, very pragmatic. This is a generation raised largely, I'm generalizing, as latchkey kids, very independent. Many of the Gen Xers had two parents who were working. If you are mindful of the divorce statistics, how they've been rising, some of these members of the Gen X cohort were raised by one parent. And so the independence that they experience, their ability to be adaptive, it's not by accident. Now, if you run your eyes down to the job liabilities, you see impatient. You think, I'm not impatient. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm not impatient. It's just that you're used to getting information a little bit faster. And when information is coming slowly, or you don't feel that you're getting what you need, that's where the impatience can come into play. The poor people skills, again here, it's a generalization. But what we're getting at here is when you are more comfortable sending an email or IMing a person than actually talking to them and they sit next to you or they're across the hall, that's what we're getting at when we talk about poor people skills. You just don't use them. They're not as strong. We're starting to see Gen Xers in the CAE role. Yay! Everyone's getting promoted here. I will say that the Gen X cohort, from a labor perspective, is highly in demand because we are going to see a small brain drain with the baby boomers retiring. Since that's a bigger cohort, there are going to be more spots available for those Gen Xers who are ready to step up. Let's talk about some other Gen X preferences. They're really into having merit rewarded, meaning I'm doing a good job. King me, reward me. The fact that other person's been there for 5 years, I've only been here for 2, that shouldn't matter. I want to be judged on what I'm able to produce. Consequently, if we want to keep the Gen Xers, we should be giving them a lot of development opportunities. And sometimes people don't realize when they're in a development opportunity. So I think we need to be very transparent about that. We really should enable them to multiplex as much as they're comfortable. So giving them different projects to juggle and making sure that they have a coach, because if they're mentored, they'll be able to step up even faster and better, which will be good for the organization and good for them. When the Gen X is the boss, again, I'm going to profile, they tend to be energetic, translation, quicker, faster, and they want things done now. They come up with a strategy, they come up with an idea, and they're focused on, okay, when can this be implemented? They're very interested in having a network, by the way. The network might be a virtual network, not just a real network. And they definitely want to leverage technology wherever possible. And it's not technology the way baby boomers think about technology as an add-on, but rather how can we use technology through the work that we're doing. So that's the profile on the Gen X boss. And so here's a poll question for you. Think about the Gen X bosses you've worked for. I'm just imagining now some of you might be sitting in a room with a coworker, and that coworker could be your Gen X boss. Hadn't imagined that. Might not be a good idea to answer. Let somebody else respond if you're in a group environment. Look, let me know when you want to close this poll.
Okay, looks like we're getting a good number of responses in, so we'll just let everybody have a few more seconds to answer. So while we're doing that, just if you haven't sent in your questions, I just want to remind you can. We're getting a lot of really good ones. People are asking a lot about managing up, so we'll try to get to that during the presentation, and a lot of other interesting topics. And just as a reminder, we are doing 8 poll questions throughout the hour, so you need to answer at least 6 to meet that 70% minimum standard set by the NASBA ruling, or by the NASBA accreditation that we follow for the CPE purposes. So today you need to answer 6 out of the 8 polling questions over the next hour. So we'll go ahead and show Ann the results, and then she can comment on them.
So here again, similar to the other, more true than not true, which I think probably is as good as it's going to get. I said this earlier, I am talking about profiles. I am talking about basically stereotypes. I'm speaking in generalities, and every person is going to have a unique story. But more true at least gives us somewhat of a target and gives us some ideas about how we can use this information. So now what I'd like to do is focus on the Gen X boss and talk about a couple of tips for the Gen X boss who's the boss of other Gen Xers, baby boomers, and millennials. So I want to start with the peer-to-peer. I always think peer-to-peer is always a little challenging. The first point under Gen X is communicate that similar perspectives may not always mean collaboration or consensus decision making. So one of the differences between the baby boomer cohort and the Gen X cohort is the way they were educated. Generally, the schools for the baby boomers had the students facing the front of the room, whereas beginning with the Gen X generation, the students were working in pods or in teams. When you were raised with teamwork, the idea of working alone, it's like, well, why would I do that? I work in a team. And so what we're getting at here is just because you're peers doesn't always mean that we're going to make decisions together. And just because we're the same generation, it doesn't mean we're always going to see things, the same way. The comment about having established an open door policy, there's a subset of the baby boomers that tends to be a little bit more, dare I say it, elitist than the Gen Xers are. The Gen Xers tend to be more populist, if you will. So the idea of having an open door policy is, I think it's good for everyone, not just the other, the other Gen Xers, so that they know that they can talk to you. The fact that you are their boss doesn't mean that you're not open to their, to their ideas. As I mentioned earlier with the baby boomers, if you can figure out a way to recognize their specialness and leverage that, that would be, I think, the best thing that you could do with the baby boomers. How can you capitalize on their talent and yet still encourage them to use and leverage the technology? With the millennials, I think you need to provide fair, direct, and balanced feedback, leading with the good, not just covering the things that they need to change. I'm particularly stressing that for audit, because I think in audit we get so used to talking about the defects, talking about what wasn't done. And I think, let's face it, we're a monitoring function. We're looking at the exceptions. But I do think when it comes to the millennials, they really need to understand what good looks like and what they've done that contributes to good. Giving them some mentoring, also very important, and giving them a lot of training. Just one more comment about the feedback comment about, telling them about the good and the bad. That's important to do for every generation, let's face it. But particularly with the millennials, we don't want to pop their balloon of optimism. They've come out of school, they've got their whole lives ahead of them, the sky's the limit, and I don't know about you, I don't want to be the one that's putting that little pin in that balloon. I want them to see, an upside. So with that, I'm going to leave the Gen Xers, and I'm going to move over and talk about the millennials for a couple of minutes here, and talk about their core values. I just mentioned one of their biggest assets, their optimism. The other thing that I think is wonderful is the way they've just integrated technology, into their lives. As a cohort I'm talking about, they tend to be, pretty upbeat. And frankly, who wouldn't be? They've got their whole lives, ahead of them. The liability, if you run your eye down to that part of the slide, the need for supervision, you might be saying, well, gee, they're millennials, they're right out of school. But sometimes they ask a lot of questions. So if you were comparing the millennials to the Gen Xers would ask questions, but they'd also try to figure it out on their own. The millennials, again, I'm generalizing, tend to like to be on a shorter string. So they might have more questions per assignment than if you're a Gen Xer. You might be thinking, God, when I did that job, I had one or two questions. I went off, I did it. Boy, they keep coming to me. And that's what I'm talking about as the liability. Where you see the language stumped by difficult people, here again, where the Gen Xers were raised on technology, even more so, the millennials had the same experience. So let's face it, if you're used to emails and instant messaging, your people skills, your ability to read people, your ability to negotiate, to influence is going to be a little stilted. So right now, the millennials, some of them, are now in charging at the senior level, leading some jobs, leading others, and that is going to put a little pressure on their managerial skills, which are nascent, and their people skills, because they're going to have to deal with a lot of different personalities. Some other preferences for this particular cohort. They also were educated in teams, so they definitely like an inclusionary style. They like to have their input solicited. They are very used to multitasking, despite the fact that Stanford University has said multitasking does not lead to better memory retention, leads to worse memory retention, but they are used to working on more than one thing at a time. They're definitely used to things being instantaneous, so information being available, whatever they need, literally a huge sense of immediacy. And they're very comfortable with e-training, webinars, anything that is just in time, these self-directed studies. They enjoy learning from others, and they enjoy, as an extension of the inclusionary style, they enjoy teamwork. When the millennial is a boss, now generally we're not seeing a lot of millennials, as CAEs, that's not happening, but we are seeing them running projects. We are seeing them, running some teams. They really enjoy collaboration. Now you might say, well, what's bad about this? Well, sometimes collaboration doesn't always lead, I know this sounds heretical, but it doesn't always lead to a great outcome if the other people you're collaborating with don't have the knowledge or the experience that you need. But they are comfortable working in like a virtual environment, a WebEx environment, and they are they understand as an extension of themselves as a product that needs to be marketed. They understand the value of results. The terminology there, intrapreneurship, that term was coined back in the 80s to refer to entrepreneurialism that is demonstrated in a corporate environment. So people think of entrepreneurs as, small business owners or business owners. Intrapreneurship means they understand how to see revenue potential and create value within a corporate environment. And this group definitely appreciates flexible work arrangements. So now that I've given you the profile of millennials and millennial bosses, I'd like your thoughts. Think about the millennial bosses you've worked for, and in this case, it might be think about maybe you've been on a couple of projects that they've led. You might be on their team. How true is this profile that I've laid out for you? And Lark, I'm going to turn it over to you while the poll is going on.
Great. We've received a really great question, so we'll go ahead and ask one while we're waiting. This one goes back to baby boomers. What is the best communication method to use with a baby boomer boss?
The first thing I wanted to say was in person, as anachronistic as it sounds, something live. That's not to say that they don't respond to emails, but if you email them, it's not going to be this, 3-word email. I'm almost laughing. It's a little bit more old school. It's a little bit more quote unquote complete if you're looking at it through the lens of a millennial or through the lens of a Gen X. Now, face-to-face is not always possible, so, can you get them on the phone? It would be the next thing. Can you get them in a WebEx that somebody else has helped them learn how to set up? Okay, that was a little sarcastic, but I can say that because I'm a boomer.
All right, thank you for that answer. So we'll go ahead and look at the results, and we'll turn it over to you.
Very similar. So again, the audience reaction is that this has been more true than not, and that's really all we're going for. If it's somewhat true or it's true in some ways, that's really the intent of this session. Let's leverage that so that we can use this information and learn from it. Now, if the millennial is the boss, I have a couple of tips for working with other millennials and the other two generations. If you're a millennial, managing a millennial, I would definitely try to pair that millennial with the most experienced person that's on the team, so that now we can leverage not just the technical expertise, but the social experience, the life experience, and the communication ability. Of course, that presupposes that the more experienced person has the communication ability. What the other party should get in the pairing is more familiarity with the technology and leverage the millennials' technological savvy. if you're a millennial dealing with Gen Xers, I would be direct, polite, direct. I would make sure that they had, as much immediacy as they could get in terms of feedback. And I would partner with the Gen X team members to see how we could really leverage technology, because that's a common bond that unites the Gen Xers and the Millennials. And, I'm sure you're seeing the pattern now with the baby boomers, make them feel special. Truly, when they are special, make them feel special. Leverage their business acumen. If for no other reason, then the boomers have been around the longest. If they have that kind of tenure in your industry, or they have that kind of tenure in your company, you really want to harness that, because business acumen is important when we're auditing. We really need to understand the nature of the businesses that we're looking at. So up to this point, we've been focused on the top dog. We've been focused more on not just profiling each of the generations, but really looking at it through the lens of you are the boss. So now what I'd like to do in the time that we have remaining is focusing on dealing with generational differences when we are dealing with our peers, colleagues in other departments, and when we're trying to manage up and get through to our boss. So a couple of general tips. So I'm taking the perspective here where it doesn't matter whether you're a boomer or a Gen X or a millennial. A couple of things that we need to do. Every organization has its own culture. So where you see follow protocol, what I'm getting at there is when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Talk to folks, find out, how do typically people relate, to each other? Do they make appointments, or do they just pop in, and stop in? I think a good practice, regardless of the generation, is to get in the habit of tying your message to results. Where's the value creation? What's in it for the other person? Why should they be listening to you? Tie your message to overarching goal achievement. Tie your message to achievement of audit results. The third bullet where you see WIIFM, that's an acronym that stands for the radio station that everyone is tuned into, what's in it for me. And if you're looking at WIIFU, that's not what you think it is. It's what's in it for us. So when you're now thinking about, I need to tell my manager something, I think you need to put yourself in your manager's shoes, regardless of the generation, and ask yourself, how do I need to position this so that person understands why he or she is going to benefit from taking my advice or from acting on my suggestion. Nothing replaces timeliness. So if you have an idea, don't wait 3 years to share it. But by the same token, be sensitive to those times when your boss is under a great deal of stress. Maybe it's, you're trying to get the audit report out. It's close to a board meeting, and that's the number one priority. Well, talking about your PTO time, that might not be the best time to schedule that conversation. I also think that we need to read our boss or colleague to figure out, are they a driver type? Do they like you to come to the point pretty quickly? Are they very relationship-oriented? They like to chat it up a bit. How's the family? How's the dog? Before you really get to the business at hand, and use the appropriate style. Now, I want to get to focus on just a couple of things about boomers, and this should be a pattern now because it's not the first time I'm saying it in this session. Boomers like to be special, so figure out how you're going to recognize that specialness in your boss or in your colleague. Figure out how their specialness can be leveraged. What's their talent that you want to capitalize on to get results? In what way can you take advantage of, for mutual gain, their business acumen? their life experience, their understanding of the organization. And recognition goes a long way with baby boomers, goes a really long way. If we are now going to focus on the Gen Xers, again, patterns you should have been hearing through today's session. The Gen Xers like to get a harness on the team collaboration, leveraging what people know. So figure out how can we better share information, share that knowledge more quickly, more efficiently, but also give the Gen Xers a great deal of freedom to figure out how to get the results, achieved. And they do like their communication to be as immediate as possible, but uncluttered. So, if you can figure out how to get immediate feedback going, you'll really capitalize with your colleagues, and you'll also capitalize when managing up. Somehow or other, wait, don't answer that poll slide yet. I lost my millennials. How could I lose my millennials? Here we go. I found them. So if you are trying to manage through, you have colleagues who are millennials, and you might be a boomer, you might be a Gen X, you might be another millennial. Let's figure out how we can make sure that their voice is heard. Make sure that their opinion is tapped, and if it's not used, we're giving them feedback as to why it's not being used. Leverage technology with the millennials as much as you can, and expect them, and I would challenge them, to use that skill in technology to come up with solutions to issues that we're facing as we're trying to get our audits done and get our work done. So here's that poll slide. How important, in your view, is it for managers to focus on addressing these generational differences? You think it's something that's very important, somewhat important, not important at all? And Lark, I'm going to turn it over to you for this polling slide.
All right, well, everybody answered the last polling question. Before we close everything out, I want to ask a question about negotiation. And this person's asking, how do you manage a negotiation with a person of the same generation looking for better results beyond the obvious, statements like common sense?
So repeat the beginning of that. How do you?
Yeah, this person's really asking, how do you negotiate with your peer? So someone out of your same generation. How do you best negotiate with them?
So when I think about a negotiation, I think first about where I want to end up. I know that sounds really selfish, but I do. And then I think about what that end will mean to the other party. Notice I haven't yet started to consider the profile of the other party. I'm just trying to float in my own mind, okay, if this is what I want. So let's say you want to raise. So now that's what you want to negotiate with someone. Well, if you just put that out there, I want to raise. Well, negotiation means a trade. So they're giving you everything. So when you're planning the negotiation, I would say, what are you expecting to offer up in exchange for that? Now, that's where, as you come up with that answer, what am I going to offer up in exchange for that raise? That's when I would now start to think about, okay, what are the organizational priorities? Who is this person, and what is going to be important to them? So now, if you know that, let's say they're looking for a technological solution, that's something that's important to them, and you can offer that. And the only reason I mentioned technology is because we have come up with that as something that is valued more by the Gen Xers, or I shouldn't say more, that's not true, more naturally valued by the Gen Xers and the Millennials than the baby boomers. So what I'm trying to get at here is I think you would negotiate as usual, and you would feather into or layer into your consideration, who is this person? What is their role in the organization? What are some of these generational factors that might be important to them? Does that make some sense?
Yeah, that sounds good. So I know we're at the end of the hour, so I'll show everybody the results, and you can close out the webinar.
Yeah, and once again, it looks like everyone's thinking that it's a pretty important thing to do. So I know we're at the end of the show, so I just want to say when you do the right things in the right way, you have nothing to lose because you have nothing, to fear. So hopefully we've given you a couple of ideas that you can use to manage more effectively and work more effectively with different generations, up, down, and across in your organization.